started. So the first item on the agenda is public comment. Is there anybody here from the public to make a comment? Seeing none, moving right along, right to attendance. Rom.
Present.
Bob.
Here.
Joe.
Here.
Patrick. Jason.
Here.
Scott.
Here.
Michael.
Here.
Ajit. Doesn't look like he's here yet. Lauren is not attending today. Rose.
Here.
Jan.
Here.
Fred. Duani.
Here.
Maura.
Here.
Susan.
Present.
Brian.
Good morning.
Awesome. Grace.
Here.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. All right. Good morning. We have a pretty
Katie, I think Fred joined. So
I did. You could add me.
awesome. Welcome. Good
Thanks.
morning. So we have a pretty big agenda. We have a number of presentations on our learning agenda, a higher education survey that was conducted, and then architecture recommendations that are coming from DISC. So I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, who's going to give us just a quick update on the learning agenda that we will then be bringing to the executive board.
Great, thanks, Katie. And do you have the slides ready, or was I to have them ready? I can have them ready.
I do not have them.
Okay, so
I'm so
I
sorry.
will talk about them as I will talk about what's going on as I pull them up. So good morning, everyone. For those who I don't know, my name is Rachel Leventhal-Weiner. Once upon a time, I was the data governing board representative from the Office of Early Childhood, but now I sit on the data and policy analytics team. I've been here for about 18 months, leading evaluation and impact work related to the state's American Rescue Plan funded projects. And that role is changing and expanding a little, which is really exciting to include more research related to P20 WIN. And I joined the group, I would say back in December, to start thinking about revamping the learning agenda for P20 WIN broadly writ. The layout and the membership has changed over the last 2 years. So the learning agenda that existed before was sort of focused really primarily on workforce and education and early childhood, and so we wanted to expand it to reflect the new membership. I should back up and say a learning agenda is basically a flexible list of questions that people are interested in pursuing related to either the project that you're leading, the bureau or unit or division that you lead, the agency that you lead. And it's a vehicle that we're using with our American Rescue Plan funded projects, sort of taking advice from US Treasury and from evaluation.gov to actually encourage people to have questions they're trying to answer with their research. So that way, when we're approached by requesters, we can ask ourselves, does this fit into our learning agenda? And now, does this learning agenda reflect what we really want to know? So folks joined us back in December, and we went through an exercise using a Jamboard with virtual sticky notes. We reorganized all the questions that we generated into something that people could reflect on. And I presented that back earlier this calendar year. So our goal today, we presented it, we made sure that it was reflective of everyone's input, and we also solicited input offline for those who couldn't participate or wanted to enhance what they saw. So today it was included in your board packet, and what we wanted to do was just sort of do one final, like last call for input and feedback on that learning agenda, because it's what we'll present to the executive board. And I am still in the process of pulling it up. So as I do that, does anyone have any questions about what you're about to see, the process, feedback, anything like that, as we get ourselves set up? And I'll just, as I am not looking at the screen because I'm pulling up the learning agenda, I'll also do a quick plug for the fact that the work that this comes from, the sort of is related to the American Rescue Plan work. We also have a lot of really great resources for our data people across the state. So we've been doing a lot of capacity building around building learning agendas, and then how to actually translate your learning agenda into a data collection and analysis strategy. So if you're interested in just having this conversation for your own agency or your own project, don't hesitate to reach out. We've been running a number of workshops, very akin to some of the kinds of workshops that I used to run when I was at the Data Collaborative, for folks who are familiar with that. Okay, I have what we need. So I'm about to screen share. Everyone good with screen sharing? I see nodding. Great. Okay, so we had a learning agenda that had a limited amount of focus areas. So the focus areas here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 focus areas that encompass all sort of 15 or so agencies that are now members of P20 WIN. And these are we took feedback on the iconography, on the wording. And so now what we'd like to do is just cycle through the next few screens, and those list some of the sample questions. And these were in your board packet, screenshots of, or like these slides in particular. So I don't necessarily need to read all of the questions, but we have 7 areas of focus. So before I move ahead, how do these 7 areas of focus feel to people? You can like in real life, thumbs up. You can emoji thumbs up. You can type an emoji in the chat, thumbs up. Okay. Seeing some reactions, so that's good. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Ajit did 2 things. Ajit did moving thumbs up. So that was like a lot of enthusiasm. Okay, so starting at the top, higher education. There were some questions. These were generated from both our higher education institutions and other places like labor and education. So we had some questions around financial aid, student success metrics, sort of the idea of like what happens when we're done with our training, and to what degree are folks employable and earning living wages. So this is the first area. Pause for feedback. Remember, a learning agenda is flexible and iterative. It is guiding, but it is not binding. So these aren't the only kinds of questions, but these were the questions that really rose to the top that were generated from this group. So if you were reading these questions, you're like, I have some other questions. Fantastic. Send them our way and we'll add them, because this is meant to reflect the curiosities that we have, and also the authority and limitations we have. So at the Office of Early Childhood, we wouldn't ask questions we didn't have the authority to pull levers on to solve. So I'm going to go ahead to the next slide if there's no feedback. Housing security. So there's a lot of funding right now, especially in the American Rescue Plan, going into housing. So there were some questions around programs and services related to housing assistance, the impact of housing assistance, access to affordable housing, and how it relates to family economic security and schooling outcomes. This is an area of interest for sure for our American Rescue Plan team. Okay. Physical and behavioral health. So this is a sort of a newish area for the team, because we've added some agencies that have specialties in this area. So definitely focusing on addiction treatment services, prevalence of opioid use. But there's a lot of behavioral health services being funded by the American Rescue Plan we're really interested in exploring. So these are some of the questions. There's probably like, triple the number of questions we could list here that people have in general. So remember, flexible, iterative, not binding. So if you see things here that you'd like to add, there's still time. Families, children, and communities. So there's some things that rose to the top around state services and permanency for children, crossover youth, so youth that are engaged in DCF care and in the judicial system, as well as access to some early childhood services and how they impact families and recently born children. Okay. Justice, incarceration, and reintegration is another area. So questions around what successful reintegration looks like, how the DOC collaborates with community stakeholders to accomplish their mission, questions about the probation system, and questions about workforce development, how it impacts folks pre-release and post-release. Okay, everyone's nodding. This is great. Doing great. Early and K-12 education. So there's a lot, no shortage of questions about the impacts of Office of Early Childhood Programs on early ed outcomes, juvenile justice and public schooling. Just general schooling outcomes is not a question that's listed here, but as a sociologist of education, I could probably add a lot here. Ajit Gopalakrishnan, what is your question? I see your hand raised.
Oh, just two thoughts. One is the whole disengaged, disconnected,
Yep.
overage, undercredited population and the outcomes of those. So the work that's now in legislation that
Yeah, we should
will
add
be
that.
codified. So I think that's one I think we should bake in here.
Yep.
And am I to presume that the post high school outcomes of high school graduates, I'm not sure it's covered under the higher education realm. Some of it is because we are obviously interested in seeing our students pursue higher education and earn post-secondary credentials, but we also have students who go directly into the labor force.
Mhm.
So something around, and maybe that's the
Might be on the
workforce
workforce
development.
slide. Yep.
I know. So I'm just thinking about that post high school outcomes kind of thing, and maybe it's covered in the other two. But
If it's
Hi
not,
there.
though, we can reflect it somewhere. Hi, Bob.
Hi, how are you?
Super.
So
How are you?
obviously WIOA, our performance is second and fourth quarter after exit. And we do take into consideration post graduate credentials that occur 1 year after exit, if the person is still employed or in an educational experience. So that is covered somewhat under workforce. I just wanted to mention that.
And so we should just be sure that it's reflected as a question, especially because we have that
Absolutely.
recurring data request.
Yep.
But I think that's a really important thing to think about here is that questions will bubble up that maybe aren't reflected here. These are almost, one of the experiences I've had over the last few months, and Katie, I know we have other things, so I want to make sure we cover. We just have one more slide. But part of my role in the evaluation impact space is to really work with applied researchers and academics. We've been doing a fair number of what we're calling roadshows with institutions of higher ed. And the question we receive repeatedly is, what are the state's priorities? Like, if we want to partner with the state and use administrative data and be your partner, how do we know what your priorities are? So in some ways, this learning agenda is a reflection of some of the priorities. It's not a limited, it's like, it's, including but not limited to these questions. And it helps folks see where the priorities sit. So we don't have, the researchers we've been talking with are super excited about trying to partner, and they understand, or at least hear us when we say they have to help us first before they help themselves. So we're trying to encourage folks to think about how they could both serve their own research interests and potential academic responsibilities, as well as help the state. So this is just a starting point. And if we think that things should be reflected here definitively, then we have time to do that before we present it to the executive board. Okay, so I think workforce development, maybe the last one. Wait, let's see. Boop. Yep, it is. And what are some of the outcomes from our workforce training programs? What are some cost-effective programs, or what's the cost effectiveness of the programs that we're running? How do different institutions contribute to the labor force and common career pathways? So some of that's reflected in what you said, Ajit and Bob, but I think we should probably carve out a question that really fits in somewhere where we just measure. But we talk about measuring outcomes specifically for graduates.
The other thing in terms of workforce development is that we have a number of terrific grants here in Connecticut that we're working on and that we continue to get, which are going to be exploring some very interesting concepts. One is the Recovery Friendly Employer Recovery Workforce Initiative, where we're engaging with employers in terms of recovery, both from mental health and substance abuse. And our partners with Department of Public Health and also the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services are involved in that. And then, of
That's
course,
cool.
we just received a $7 million ODEP grant to work with youth who are disabled and disconnected, and developing career paths for them, both seniors in high school through through the WIOA interpretation of that, which goes all the way to age 24. So those are two very interesting things in workforce development that I just wanted to mention. So I think we are in Connecticut really looking at some very unique initiatives and like trying to stretch out our boundaries of what we can look at and also in terms of populations that we can serve. So I think you're right that to identify some of those would be really important.
And I think you flagged something really important that's not reflected here. We're super interested in pathways, like, you know, credentials, what happens when our students graduate, what happens when they go from system to system. But what about the workforce itself? And how is the workforce itself doing? And I think that the grant that you mentioned sounds really interesting. And I think that that's one question that's not really reflected here. And we may want to consider that, whether we do that under physical and behavioral health or we do that here. So great contributions. These are part of your board packets. So I think the expectation is that we would present them today. So you'd have some visibility awareness of them. You'd review them on your own, take them back to your respective branches, and then any feedback should bubble up. Katie, by what date? So that way we can be prepared for the executive board.
The first week of June would be great. We do have one more data governing board meeting before the executive board meeting at the end of June. But it would be good to compile this together for a final review. So if you could provide any sort of feedback or new questions by the first week of June, that'd be great. And then Rob and Ajit, we can reach out.
Yeah, we'll reach out separately just to make sure we crystallize the feedback that you've raised. But thanks to everyone for your engagement and participation. This tool is actually really useful in helping to explain to others how they can serve as partners and explore questions that you have. And we're really excited about just getting this crystallized for the future. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Rachel. That was super helpful and awesome, and really looking forward to everyone's feedback on this. Moving on and somewhat related, we have Nat McLaughlin here, I believe, from the Tobin Center, who recently conducted a survey of higher education. So he is here, I hope. I don't see him.
I'm here, Katie.
Okay, great. To sort of give an update or an introduction to the survey and the findings that they had.
Wonderful. And let me figure out how to share on Teams really quick. I always have to relearn it. Let's see.
I can see your slides. I can see.
All right, so you can see slides. Wonderful. I just need to work my way back to the screen so I can actually see folks. Awesome. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Nat McLaughlin, and I am a senior research and policy manager at the Tobin Center for Economic Policy at Yale. And just like Katie said, we're going to talk about some work we did to engage higher ed around building research partnerships with the state of Connecticut. So let's see. We can move forward. All right. So I'm going to provide a little bit more context on, who I am, what the Tobin Center is, and what this effort was. Then jump into some of the key findings, challenges, and opportunities for researchers to engage with Connecticut data. And then talk a little bit about, progress to date and paths forward. So that's the plan for this. And I will be very conscious of time and try to keep us on schedule. All right, so, first, foremost, like, who am I? What is the Tobin Center, and what am I doing here today? So the Tobin Center for Economic Policy is Yale's domestic public policy center. It's in the econ department at Yale. It was founded during COVID, and as you see up on the screen, our mission is to advance research and policy to strengthen families, communities, and the nation, where, we aim to advance applied policy research and evidence-based policy at the local, state, and national levels. For my part, I get to do this really in the Connecticut context. I get to, work with, support research collaborations in Connecticut with state government, with nonprofits, and Tobin-affiliated faculty. I also get to work on building data and research capacity, within state government and elsewhere. And then finally, I also support the Connecticut Governor's Fellowship Program, which is a program, public-private partnership to to provide a pipeline for early and mid-career data tech management talent into state service to work on state priority programs. So a somewhat diverse portfolio. I come to Tobin originally from the Office of Policy and Management, where I worked on budget and American Rescue Plan issues for the secretary. And before that, I spent some time during COVID working in the New Haven mayor's office. And background, I'm a military officer by background, so I've made a pretty dramatic shift from defense to domestic public policy over the last 5 or 6 years. Awesome. And so I want to jump right in. And, first, I think with these efforts where we think about building these and strengthening these research partnerships, often they focus on challenges. But first, I wanted to just focus on like all the progress that's been made to date, because we wanted to really build on that progress as part of that effort. From passing P20 went into law about a decade ago, to expanding the membership and the purpose of this group, to making meaningful progress to improve data sharing procedures, processes, the learning agenda being a huge part of it. I thought, Rachel, that was like a really great transition into this topic, so thank you. To, of course, launching the State Department of Ed Center for Connecticut Education and Research Collaboration. I think CCRC want to highlight because it's sort of like our starting argument for this engagement. All right, and so, what did we do? We took a hypothesis-driven approach and with the basic question of how do we build on and leverage the success of CCRC towards a research collaborative tied to P20 Win. Part of the motivation here was the SLDS grant that you all were awarded, and like thinking through like what kinds of things would do researchers struggle with when they're trying to work with CT administrative data? How can we sort of like build on the existing model to do something new? So I'm going to keep running. And so what did we actually do? So as Katie mentioned, we did a survey, and we had 48 respondents to the survey focused on identifying barriers and opportunities to collaboration with Connecticut administrative data. This was geared towards higher ed researchers. 48 researchers from across 15 research and higher ed institutions responded to the survey. Interestingly, there's 28 had not previously worked with CT administrative data, so I thought that was like an interesting divide. We've also interviewed CT Connecticut higher ed researchers, sort of like building our depth on some of the topics, the challenges, the opportunities. And we hosted a webinar as well as an event for researchers. And we got a really nice breadth of engagement with the higher ed research community. I wouldn't claim that this was representative, but I think we got a lot of diversity in terms of background and professional interest and experience working with CT data, from zero experience to direct research partnerships with agency or agencies, to having done P20 win requests and participating in CCRC scoped projects. So that was the approach. And recognizing time, I'm going to dive sort of like straight into key findings, and I'm going to be very high level here. And of course, I'm happy to answer questions at the end, or follow up after this to answer questions. So I think broadly, one, there's a lot of energy, excitement, enthusiasm for working with CT administrative data. Researchers describe Connecticut as like this innovative place, as a like a mid-sized state that is really doing ambitious and innovative policy pilots, or launching programs. And so to researchers, that becomes like exciting and interesting, innovative, cutting edge social policy research. But alongside the opportunity, I think we identified a number of hurdles or challenges to working with administrative data that could serve as essential points of focus as we seek to build these relationships going forward. And the next few slides will dive into those. So the first sort of bucket here was around navigational challenges. Researchers being uncertain about how to access data, what pathways, what was available. Even being uncertain about what P20 Win was or how to utilize it, what its benefits were, what the difference between using P20 Win versus going direct to agencies was. I think there was relatively low awareness there around the folks we interviewed and surveyed. Non-participation of some state agencies was also flagged as an issue here. Oftentimes researchers have a focused interest, and that didn't necessarily align with the members of P20 Win, and maybe there's a state agency just sitting outside of P20 Win. And then finally, a big point was sort of like difficulty in using some of the reference materials around P20 Win. And so, thinking about opportunities here, I think better, this was sort of like an initial understanding, and maybe there's opportunity to deep dive and really understand like issues with using reference materials, making them maybe more user friendly, that sort of thing, by directly working with the researchers. On the awareness piece, I know Rachel's doing the roadshow, as she mentioned, but finding ways to engage with the research community, building that awareness, I think is critical. And then centralizing, making easier to know and to use information around pathways to access data. And I'm going to keep just plugging along here on the research and policy alignment. Opportunity to engage state leaders, policymakers, understand their priorities was flagged as this big challenge and interest among researchers who wanted to do this applied policy data. Finding that alignment of research interest and policy interest is often critical to making these successful research collaborations. And so that was a big item in our survey and in these conversations. And then a couple other items that were brought up around some hesitancy to engage with researchers on data projects, which I think directly ties into the fourth bullet on the slide around data moving at the speed of trust. And so when we think about opportunities, building these creating these opportunities to bring state leaders and researchers together just seems so critical to both understanding priorities and building that trust that can enable these kinds of partnerships to go forward. And of course, I think the other thing which you all are working on as we speak is building and maintaining this this learning agenda that really ties to your priorities in the at this point in time. I think that's hugely critical to researchers understanding what the state's interested in. All right, on legal agreements, I don't think anyone will be surprised here that legal agreements can be complex and difficult to execute. And we found that even with the best researched and supported researchers, that often this was a big pain point for them. A particular issue here was meeting state data and privacy and security requirements. Could be challenging, especially for those without those research supports. And then I'll also add that while P20 Win is standardized its agreements, agencies often have varying or non-standard ways of doing these research collaborations. So to the extent researchers have to work with an agency directly, there's some inconsistency there. So in terms of opportunities, standardizing privacy and security guidance was one thought we had. Another thought we had here was, around the privacy security concerns is exploring secure analytic environments as a step that might solve this problem among many other problems. All right, jumping right through to time to access. Researchers reported that it could take months or years to receive data. But even stronger, even sort of like more of a priority here was like getting to a quicker yes or no response on data requests. It could often take months of effort to get some clarity on whether a data request is feasible and will go forward. And so getting that early yes or no could be very valuable to researchers. And so, a couple of the opportunities we identified, one is policies, standard timelines for responses to data requests might provide some transparency and help researchers like go in at least with their eyes wide open on these sorts of things. And then also, considering technical solutions that might sort of reduce manual operations and agency burden, enable sort of like quicker, shortening the timeline, so to speak. All right, jumping through to data quality. This was another significant issue flagged. And I think the overarching issue here was just significant concerns around whether data, once going through this process, would be usable for research purposes. And so anything that the state could do to like upfront, provide some transparency into the data quality for the underlying data sets would be of great value to these researchers. And one example, one researcher reported jumping through like significant efforts to obtain a data set that ultimately they had to deem unusable for research purposes, and they abandoned the project. Then finally, on the challenges, opportunities front, no surprise here, funding was a critical enabler and a limiting factor in the research process. I think an interesting finding from the survey that's highlighted in the table was that actually a number of respondents reported that less than or equal to $50,000 in terms of funding might be sufficient to launch some of these projects. I think there's a going in assumption here that it might be a lot higher. And so I think that might be a point to explore, like what level of funding can get some of these projects off the ground. And then there's other opportunities. The feds issued new uniform guidance that explicitly enables federal resources towards data and program evaluation that I think is worth understanding and socializing. And then also there are always philanthropic opportunities, especially call out JPAL Lover as a great example of this. And I think I am probably over on time, so I'm going to, and Katie nods her head diplomatically. So I think like a number of these issues are no surprise to this group. My evidence is like all the things you're doing, some of which I attempted to capture on this slide, but the federal awards, the partnership with West Ed Disc, which I think is presenting next, working with the Governor's Fellow to build connectivity between P20 WIN and DSS, developing clear security guidance, pursuing opportunities to understand and find sustainable funding, I think are all evidence that you all know most of these, have a good sense of a lot of these problems and are working to address them. And then I'll just add generally that solutions that bring together researchers with this group to understand these challenges and opportunities are valuable. Bringing together researchers with state leadership to identify policy priorities, I think, is another huge step. Creative, sustainable means to fund research, I think, is critical. And then policy timelines, guidance, and technical solutions are also, I think, part of the equation here. And so I am going to stop because I am way over, and I think that's my last slide. So,
Do we have time for a couple of questions if there are any? If anyone just wants to speak up if you have any questions. Are these slides, Nat, that we can share with the group, and would there be interest from the group in seeing them?
Yeah, so these are draft slides. I can send over after this to share with the group. And I recognize I jumped through that relatively quickly. There was a lot to share.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you for doing that and the work that you put into it. So it's very relevant to what we're doing right now. No questions? Thoughts?
Well, the only thought I have is, was the discuss, well, there's a lot of thoughts, but one thing that just to remind everyone is that on the data quality issue, so many of our data sets are created for other purposes other than research. And, it is just a fundamental challenge of our life to take administrative data or data that's collected for one purpose, such as we collect data to see if people are eligible for unemployment benefits. And that's a very multi-dimensional aspect of somebody's life and career and their family. I mean, there's so many things that go into that. And then to turn that into some sort of data point that can then be useful for research is not an easy task and not a cheap task. And I'm sure every agency on this call could have similar things to say. So, we certainly appreciate the struggle that researchers have with data quality, and we're doing our best. But some of the issues are just so fundamental that, our job is to send out the unemployment checks to the people who need them. And then secondarily, we get some data back that might be useful for research. And I'm the research guy, so I shouldn't say secondarily because I think that's so important. But but I get it. The people outside this door here who are helping people feed their families, or maybe have something else in their mind than making sure the data is clean for me.
I think that's such a great point, and I think a lot of the researchers that I actually talk to really understand that distinction, that administrative data, like, primary purpose is to do something other than research. And I think data quality is one of those, like, really fundamental challenges. That's maybe one of the hardest things to solve. For in a research context in particular.
Thanks, Patrick. Good point. Thanks, Nat. That was great, super helpful. And when you send me the slides, I will make sure to send them out to the group.
Amazing. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everybody.
So moving right along, the feature of our meeting, I think. So everything else that we've discussed has been leading up to this point. We have Omar and Leia from DISC to sort of give a brief security closeout, but a presentation on some architecture recommendations. We are kind of lowish on time for the amount of content we need to get through, but I just want to remind folks that we do have that in-person working session on June 14th that will be following the Data Governing Board meeting, which is hybrid depending on your availability. But the working session itself is going to be in person so that we can really dive into the content that's going to be presented to us here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Leia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leia Tiederman. I am the Associate Director for the Data Integration Support Center, and I've been supporting the Connecticut team in the background. Katie, can you hear me okay?
I can now. It seemed like everything froze for a second.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're good now. Oh, okay. You're
I
frozen
think
again.
she's having, yeah. I think
Oh,
she's
off
having-
camera. Am I freezing again?
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go off camera to see if that helps any while I talk.
We can hear you.
Okay, so just a little bit of a reminder of the work that DISC did with OPM to review the architecture and security and privacy and governance controls that are currently in place within the P20 WIN system. And this was done through a series of interviews with your participating agencies, and a lot of you, as I understand it. And so Omar and Barron were both on site in Connecticut in January for those meetings and interviews. And this is just a recap of those focus areas from the on-site review. There are a couple high-level areas. One was that simplification of the data matching and the data sharing processes, reviewing and updating those legal frameworks to make sure that they are all aligned, some methodology to develop that secure enclave, similar to what Nat was talking about in terms of research access, and then building that transparency of access to the data and monitoring that is needed to ensure that all those privacy and security controls are in place, and then solidifying the governance to formalize all that participation and transparency. So as part of the next steps in that security review, the final report was provided to OPM, and then DISC is supporting OPM in developing an executive summary that really highlights those high-level findings, and then further suggests recommendations, part of what we're going to review today, to secure and modernize the system. So part of the rationale for modernization is Connecticut's not alone. There's a lot of states who are at that point in their development where they realize that technology needs to catch up with what they've been doing, and they need to modernize in ways that make this all easier, right? So some of the considerations here were around really that providing consistent analytical data sets to support policy and practice, to support that learning agenda, and accelerate that timeline between requesting data or requesting analytical data and the releasing of that analytical data to researchers for use. Again, leveraging technology to increase the capacity of the P20 WIN resources, including the staff, to reduce even the agency's level of effort in automating and access controls and using those modern tools. And then again, like in support of that level of effort, reducing those manual processes around data movement that we know are prone to security incidents and human error. So we're going to provide some recommendations, as Katie mentioned, for further discussion in June. These recommendations need some further research and considerations, including your alignment to your use case. You already have one use case that was sort of defined there from Nat around secure enclaves for analytical data. There's further use cases, and those are part of the alignment to like what is the appropriate security solution or technical solution. There's also cost and benefit reviews that need to be done here. And then there also needs to be consideration and some alignment to your current challenges. You want to pick a solution that will mitigate those current challenges. So all of these options have some similarities. They do a couple of things. They isolate partner data. So all of the data that is provided by each of your contributing partners stays isolated. We're assuming that the identifiers are all linked by the data integration hub, and then the data are quality assured, the analytical data are quality assured by the operating group. And then all of these options also provide analytical data for requests. So there's also some additional decision making here, right? We talked about the use cases. You really need those use cases to drive why or what the appropriate technical solution is. Depending on what service providers, cloud providers you have, they're going to have a little bit of a different architecture or tools available. And then you're going to need to do some work to really discover what will be needed by that provider. And then what linkage tools will be used is also something to consider. So before we hop into the actual options, are there any questions about any of that? Okay, I'm going to keep moving. So the first option here is a co-hosted model. So this is recommending the Coleridge Initiative, which is a organization that provides this hosted model. And they have an administrative data research facility, and these are some of the key components of their ADRF. And so this option would provide all of these tools and components to P21. So the input of the data, the ingestion of the data exports, the training and the research, and then those project workspaces for use. Along with, Coleridge has its own contractual and data agreements for use and participation in the ADRF. This is a little bit of a really high level overview of the ADRS service flow. So starting with the data, the source, the agencies providing data, and then ADRF ingests that and hosts it, creates those research project workspaces, and then allows the researchers, internal or external, to conduct the research to do those analyses. Yes.
Is this, so this is like a SaaS solution? We just pay for this service?
Correct. Yes, you're
Okay.
paying Coleridge as the hosting entity to provide the infrastructure to support this model.
Okay, thanks.
And they have a lot of information on their website. It's the Coleridge Initiative. I think it's .org. So then we talked about go ahead, there's another question.
I was just going to say that I'm going to circulate links to Coleridge and the other options after the meeting.
Right.
Folks.
So we talked about project workspace isolation. So the agency data, partner data can be isolated. So this is just a little bit of an overview of the model of how that works. So the agency data is separate from the research project workspaces, and it's separate from each other. And then researchers themselves are given those permissions based on what they should have access to. And then this is an option for shared project workspace. So if you have researchers that are working in the same research project from different organizations or from different partners, the Coleridge Initiative also the ADRF also allows that sort of flexibility. Any other questions about Coleridge? So I'm going to turn this over to Omar for the second option, which is a Connecticut cloud build.
Hey everybody, good morning. My name is Omar. I'm a security SME with DISC, and I'm going to walk through building your own infrastructure as opposed to using Coleridge's solution. So go to next slide, please. So this is a very high level example of building your own secure enclave environment. And you may notice that it looks very kind of familiar to the last diagrams that we saw with Coleridge, where you're isolating workspaces for each environment. So in this case, partner agency data would be transferred via possibly an existing tool like Axway into the Data Hub workspace, where you conduct the data matching process using a virtual desktop pool in the workspace. Once the data matching was completed, the outputs would be moved to an administration workspace, which is also isolated for any data quality, data validation and quality checking. And once you have those results, that data would be moved into the data request workspace, which would be the research workspace, in which the researchers would have access to data with tools like RStudio, SAS, whatever data analytic tools you choose to use. they would be conducting analysis in that workspace. One thing to keep in mind is that as data moves and flows through this environment, you'll see that I have those little monitors noted. Data and audit logs are tracked through the entire process, so you have an idea of when data was moved from an environment to another environment, and you're able to keep track of the data lifecycle process. And at the end of the process, obviously, if you have any data retention or data deletion that needs to be conducted, you're able to track that through the entire lifecycle. So that's a good benefit. Also, you'll notice that each of the workspaces are segmented by network security groups or firewalls. So you have strict rules in place to make sure that only the limited level of access is needed for each workspace, and data can't be moved outside of those spaces. I think we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is that we don't need to go back, but using something like building your own secure enclave, if Connecticut, which we did find in some of the when we were out doing the interviews, we did find that there are some security frameworks that the state of Connecticut needed to comply with, such as NIST 800-171 for CUI. You're able to use cloud-based tools to map your architecture that you build and directly correlate it into that NIST framework and actually get an output of compliance level, so you can get your compliance score and how well you're complying with those frameworks, and actually provide reports on that if they were requested for like an audit or anything. So yeah, we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so this would be a short term. So the interim enclave would be right now a short term solution to address any of the high risks that were found from the findings. And usually what we find with these kind of systems is that the initial build, the first iteration, addresses the major findings, and then as the infrastructure matures and you go through process of continuous improvement to improve your security posture and processes within the system, they kind of develop. But right now you'd be looking at more of a minimalist cloud build solution. So
as an interim solution, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Any questions?
I do have a question.
Yep.
Can you describe a little more about what you mean by minimalist version, short term? Like, what's being cut out or not built initially?
Yeah. So there's if in the findings from DISC, there's a lot of information, a lot of recommendations, and this solution would be kind of taking what the processes are currently being done or conducted by the P20 system, and applying a similar process, but in a cloud-based solution where you can isolate those environments. So you wouldn't be looking at trying to remediate all of those findings with this initial build. You'd only be looking at remediating like the high level findings, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, part of it is not, I'm hoping that the report can be shared so we can know what the high level and what all the findings were. That would be really helpful. Thanks.
Yep.
So some of the difference between like an interim enclave and something more robust might mean.
You froze again, Leah.
Administration workspace, and maybe you're not getting into the more the use cases associated with researcher access. You're really just addressing the highest security areas that were identified under that assessment, and so some of those more nuanced and robust tools wouldn't be part of the initial interim build. Does that help? Scott, is there anything to add there?
No, and Leah, we missed part of your response, I think.
Oh, I'm
Dropped out, but
sorry.
I think especially because we're going to end in 3 minutes, like this, we can go into a little more detail. We wanted to, I think, introduce the ideas, and Jen, the questions I think are good ones as to like what would be sort of in an interim model. So this is, I think, just kind of introducing the ideas, but what you're talking about, like some of the things for administration or some of the like the statistical tools, like shaving off some of the things that are not sort of strictly necessary. That's. And interim is not like a 5-year interim phase. I think we were thinking,
Yeah.
okay, we could do this for a couple of months, hopefully.
So there was a question, Fred, about the report, the security report does not address estimates of staffing costs required for implementing your own solution. It was really just a review of the security posture of the system. One of the things that is like the group's going to need to dig into in that June meeting is what are those staffing costs? What would it mean to implement your own versus another solution? So DISC will continue to support P20 Win and the agencies, and we will be there in person. Baron will be there in person in June to help facilitate that conversation and discussion. Scott, do you want to talk about the sort of the next steps here?
Yeah, and Katie, please feel free to fill in for these. So we'll send the slides out. After this, there's a lot of detail in particularly some of the diagrams. And if basically what we're looking for is if there's questions you have, like how does this work or how does this happen, cost questions, all the things that have come up, to try and get as many of those on the table before June so that we can bring those back to get those kind of consolidated, talk with DISC through them. Some things are kind of out of scope for what they're able to provide us, but we want to make sure we understand all the questions that people have before we kind of dig into the details. The DISC folks, Leah, Omar, Baron, will be engaging with agencies between now and that June meeting, kind of as needed. And I know several of you spoke with them earlier, and if you want to have more detailed follow-up, we can do that between now and that June working session. Like Katie said earlier, we'll send out some links, reading materials, just more resources. Again, this is to introduce some of the options at a high level. And then we've got basically a month to dig into them in a little more detail to feed into that working session. And hopefully the working session will give us enough direction to start digging into some of the questions about the plan to implement one of the options. And I think for the questions that have come up, like those are hopefully kind of where we want to start to get to that level of detail.
Yep.
And the cost one, I think, is an important one that we know will come up. I think that's one from the OPM side, like we're very cognizant of. There's several different tools that we kind of can use to sustain the activities for this. And even Nat from Tobin Center, they've been very helpful at looking into different options for sort of funding state integrated data systems. And so like that's a partnership that's working out in different ways. So we know that's coming, and we'll look at sort of different tools available for that. Sorry, Katie, what else did I miss? We need.
I think you covered all of it, but I just want to reiterate that we will be following up with these slides with additional resources. So we'll have links to Coleridge and other state examples. Please send us your questions before the June 14th meeting. That way we can answer them at that meeting. We can have a productive, constructive discussion at that working session. I'll also follow up with some written updates for the agenda items that we did not get to at this meeting. But other than that, we're looking forward to having this conversation and having feedback from everyone here and, making a concerted, constructive step forward in this process. So there are no other thoughts. I know we're now over time. I guess we can I'm gonna stop the recording.